welcome to the Grateful Life webcast. I'm your host, Ashley Eicher. Today, we're diving into the caregiver's mindset, the emotional weight, the daily challenges, and the tools that actually work when everything feels overwhelming. We have two powerhouse experts with us who've dedicated their careers to this work. Let me introduce them properly because their experience matters. Les Dubin is a licensed clinical social worker with 25 years in the field. Les, tell us what drew you to the work and why you eventually started your own practice focused on older adults.
Well, thank you for having me. I have to say it's been quite a journey, and I really ended up somewhere I never expected to be, to tell you the truth. Around age 20, I started working in group homes for people with mental health issues, having had some family background with behavioral health issues. And so it always intrigued me. Once I decided to get my master's in social work from Wayne State University, I ended up in the medical field, even though I thought I might be in mental health. But I really fell in love with the fast pace of the medical model and sort of having the opportunity to meet a lot of different clients with different needs. And I discovered that it sort of allowed for me to incorporate the mental health work in with the medical, particularly as I was working more and more with older adults, um, and those impacted by dementia or delirium. Ultimately, 30 years now I've been in the field essentially. Almost of that has been in the hospital settings. And for the last 14 years, I've had a chance to work on the geriatric inpatient consultation team at University of Michigan Hospital, which is a great interdisciplinary team. Part of that work too, I'll just say I had the opportunity to teach at the School of Social Work for about 10 years, University of Michigan, courses in aging, but I still felt that there was something missing in the client work I was doing for support for people living with chronic health issues and their care partners. And as a result of that, I started a private practice about almost 3 years ago. It's called Maturity Matters Counseling in Ann Arbor. And we have really been very happy to be able to meet the needs of so many older adults and their care partners.
That is amazing. Okay, Jill Ladaa is a gerontologist for Brookdale Senior Living who spent years advocating for people living with dementia. Jill, what's your background and what keeps you so passionate about this work?
So I've always known I wanted to work with older adults. I grew up in the country in Pennsylvania, and all that was nearby was a nursing home.
Mm,
And so every day after school, I would go over and I would visit my friends who were the residents there. And really, that was a pivotal moment in my life because I knew at a very young age that I was passionate about older adults. So
right.
fast forward to high school, and I had a friend whose mom was a nurse in what we now call memory care. And I would make my friend take me weekly to spend hours with these residents. And again, another pivotal moment in my life. I knew I wanted to advocate for people who didn't have a voice. And so I knew I needed to learn everything about their stories to
Right.
be able to be an advocate. So fast forward to college, and there's a major for this, and it's called gerontology. And so I not only have a bachelor's degree, but I also have a master's degree in gerontology, both with a focus on Alzheimer's and related dementias. So most of my work has been in the nonprofit sector. And I'll say and because of that, I've had a lot of opportunity for advocacy work.
Right.
But what's been most meaningful for me is work that I've done for people either newly diagnosed or navigating their diagnosis. And what they taught me is really what it's like to live with a diagnosis. And it was not only uplifting, but inspiring, not only to them, but to me.
Right.
And so some of these folks, and I do refer to them as my friends because we've become very good friends, even though I'm not working in that sector anymore, we're still in communication. So there's a couple of guys that I know that wanted to advocate as well after they were comfortable with their diagnosis. And they started their own podcast.
Oh, wow.
called Living Well with Memory Loss. And it's amazing. It's advocating and educating for people who are navigating the diagnosis.
Right.
I've had a couple of other friends who sit on the National Institute of Health, and they represent the people living with a diagnosis. Personally, I'm also a care partner for my Uncle George, who is also my neighbor, and also a care partner for my father, helping my mom. My dad lives with vascular dementia and also um, moderate Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. I love that this passion started for you at such a young age and you stuck with it.
It's literally all I know, and I really want to be that voice for people who may no longer have that voice to advocate for
Right.
their needs.
Right. Les, what do you wish someone had told you when you first started working with caregivers?
Oh, there's so much, really. I think as a young person, I really was, I think, fairly young as a social worker in the hospital setting. The main thing I thought if I saw the term dementia in a chart that I knew what that meant. And the reality is I had no idea what that meant or how it impacted the lives of families and all those around the person living with the dementia. And so I think that's the main thing is that I really wish I could have had more education back, in the mid 1990s. You were still learning a lot now, but there was really very little at the time that we
Right.
knew, and there were very few resources for folks. So that's the main thing. I believe that living with any chronic health issue is a huge challenge for obviously the patient, the person living with that. But again, it ripple effects out to all those around them. And so I wish I had just taken a little bit more time to understand that better, even though I too had had the opportunity to meet a lot of people. I just had no idea what life was really like for them.
Jill, you're very intentional about language, using phrases like living with dementia as opposed to has dementia. Why is that so important to you?
Language is a powerful tool in a way that in how we perceive other people, but also how we perceive ourselves. So when we use person first language, we put the person first, we put the person before the disease.
Right.
So, for instance, I always give the um, example of blind person. You immediately just hear blind and you forget that they're a person. So that's the same with a person living with dementia
Yes.
because they're a person first.
Right.
And so we need to be more intentional about the language that we use. It's dignified and it's more respectful as well.
I absolutely agree. And both of you see caregivers at their most vulnerable moments. So, what do you want people watching today to know about why this conversation matters so much? Les, what about you?
Yeah, I think the main thing I want folks to know is that they're not alone, right? I think it's very isolating. People feel very lonely in their experience often. Um, it can feel embarrassing. There might even be some shame that people have when they have this diagnosis as if they've done something to
Right.
bring this on themselves. What we know is that over 6 million people in the United States are living with a dementia related illness. So imagine all of the families that are impacted by that, all the friends, all the neighbors, all the church friends and extended family. So it really does impact so many people, yet a lot of individuals are afraid to share that. They don't want to be treated differently. They don't want to be seen differently. And so, what we want to make sure people know is that they're not alone. That it's not a weakness to ask for help. It's actually great to share their story, and they often are surprised how many other people then can share in that experience. And it can be it can be really, really invigorating and supportive to have other people who know what that experience is like.
Absolutely. Jill, what about you?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of something that Les mentioned, and that's over 6 million people living with a diagnosis of a dementia.
Right.
There's also 12 million unpaid caregivers that are caring for a family member or a friend living with dementia. And so, to Les's point, you're not alone.
Right.
And there's so many other folks and resources out there that connection is everything. I will talk about as well receiving the diagnosis. It can come with such a whirlwind of emotions,
Right.
and just giving people permission to feel all of the feelings. And those feelings can be devastation, fear, but it can also be relief. Because a
Mhm.
lot of times people wait for a diagnosis, and having the relief of, oh, this is something I can research. This is something that I can plan ahead for.
Right.
There's reassurance to that. And I think what I want people to know most is that there's so much time between diagnosis and death. There's so much time for living and to create meaning for your life. I think where the fear comes is we think about a diagnosis of one of the dementias and we automatically have this image in our mind of what that looks like. But that's not what reality is. I've told stories in the beginning, in the introduction, of some of my friends who are living with a diagnosis,
Right.
doing wonderful things, advocating, and making a difference that provide meaning for them and their families.
Yeah. Let me sort of paint a picture. So let's say that a woman calls either one of you crying because she feels guilty about enjoying a holiday dinner with her mother. The guilt and shame is overwhelming. Les, what is really happening here emotionally?
Holidays are really tough. They are hard because we have these core memories of holidays from the past, and we often will envision what the holiday should look like. And when our family members aren't able to be with us, it's a visible reminder that things are different, that things are
Hmm.
changing. And so a lot of times people will feel shame and guilt for not including their loved ones if they've decided for some reason that isn't going to be in their best interest. So what I'd like to do is tell people first to recognize the loss, right? I'm going to talk more about the grief that comes with this diagnosis for the family and the person living too with these conditions. But um, it's really important to identify and recognize that this is different and it is grief and it's very hard. I also like to help them recognize that they can, just normalize and neutralize some of what they're feeling. That feelings are because we need to feel them. It's part of our human nature to have a certain emotion in
Hmm.
response to a certain type of stressor. And so this is really big. And I think in these situations, what I find is a lot of families are using a lot of negative self-talk and should statements like this is, mom should be here. We should find a way to make this happen.
Right.
And really what I like to do is really highlight for them that they are often being thoughtful about her needs and possibly reducing overstimulation in a lot of these situations, right? So if there's a way for mom to be present, for example, of course you want to support that even in a short, very brief visit. But often as the disease will progress, this is very common that families end up in the situation where loved ones are missing family events because of variety of reasons. But I want just people to know it's normal and to find that support and to try to not be so hard on themselves.
Well, and Jill, how can care partners create moments of joy without adding stress or tension?
This is a very timely topic for me because, as I mentioned, my dad lives with a mixed dementia. He lives with vascular dementia and moderate Alzheimer's disease. And we're talking about this topic right now and how
Right.
we celebrate Thanksgiving with my parents. And so, what we're doing is we're having our larger family Thanksgiving on Thanksgiving.
Hmm.
And then we're going to have a smaller event with my parents so that we can cut out some of that chaos, that
Right.
overstimulation, as Les pointed out. But I think at the core, what caregivers and care partners really need to think about is we need to adjust our expectations. Holidays are going to look different, and that's okay.
Right.
And that sometimes, the best thing with people living with a diagnosis is go with the flow.
Right.
What you expect usually doesn't happen in the way that you imagine it. And sometimes the most meaningful times and those memories come from spontaneity and what happens naturally. And so, one of the things that we're doing, not only with my dad, but also the work that I've done with other folks living with dementia, is it's really important to keep up with those routines
Hmm.
as much as possible, including sleep and rest. And planning those events, if you choose to include mom or dad in my case,
Right.
is when is the best time for that person.
Right.
So for my dad, it's early afternoon. So that's when we plan, although we're going to go with the flow in case that doesn't happen that way.
Hmm.
But we plan to have that meal with my dad in the early afternoon because that's when he's at his best. We want to make sure that the stimulation is very minimal.
Right.
So that's why we're having a smaller event, because a lot of times people living with a dementia have difficulty following multiple conversations,
Right.
especially if there's music playing or children laughing or dogs barking. That can all play into that anxiety and the chaos. I had a friend named Frank who lives with vascular dementia,
Hmm.
and his birthday was around four other relatives' birthday. So their tradition was to always have a birthday party and for all five of them.
Right.
And he shared with me, I love getting together with family. They're the most important part of my life, but I'm finding it difficult to be at this birthday party because there's so much going on and I'm anxious in
Right.
trying to have conversations and anticipate. So, one of the things we set up for Frank was a safe place, a quiet place for him. The party was always at his house. So, he created in his office
Hmm.
a quiet place. So, if he was feeling overwhelmed, he could go to that place.
Is brilliant.
As he progressed, he found himself in the quiet place more and more. And what the family did was bring 1 to 2 people in to celebrate and have conversations with him. Even though the party was going on at the house, that's how he was able to be successful. And that's how
Mm.
he found meaning in still celebrating not only his birthday, but
Right.
the other family members. So we need to be creative, but we also need to include the person,
Yes.
if they're able to be included, to say, hey, what are you struggling with? How can we make this event or this holiday celebration work for you that still brings meaning in your life? And also ask them, what traditions are most important to you? And
Hmm.
make sure those are the traditions that you're celebrating.
Well, and I love that you said that because I think so often we probably assume what someone needs or what they want, or especially if they are someone living with dementia. I've seen this in friends and family that we set the expectations as
Mhm.
opposed to thinking that they know what they want.
And a
And so
lot
I
of
think not
times,
making that assumption.
yes, and it's a great point, because what I've seen in my work is when someone receives a diagnosis, we automatically assume that they can no longer make their decisions
Mm.
anymore. And so we always need to include people. My neighbor George, I was with him at one point, and someone we had shared that he had a diagnosis. It was early on,
Right.
and the person looked me in the eye and said, "Well, how is he doing?" And so I shifted the conversation. I said, he's right here, just ask him. We need to include the person, and that also include the person with advanced dementia who may no longer be able to articulate. They may be able to answer with their nonverbal communication. And we need to remember that that still is communication.
Right. Right. Les, you call dementia a whole family disease. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I think that no one can understand what dementia is until they've actually experienced that in their family somehow, right? You can read every book and check every website, but until you see how it actually impacts you, then you really, really, truly see how those waves extend out and impact everyone who knows and loves the person with that diagnosis. I think that what I see in my work is, depending on where a person is in that process, it might impact people very differently, right? So a lot of adult children, for example, who, especially if they live out of the area, they care very much, but they're not necessarily seeing the day to day things. Whereas the person who's living with the person with the diagnosis is more likely to experience a lot of daily changes, which may not even seem all that profound because they're going at such a slow pace.
Right.
And when the family members come in from out of town, they're like, "Wow, this is a big change." And so that can kind of also cause some just difference of opinions in the family about where the person is with their disease process. It is very normal for guilt, shame, grief, frustration, all of those feelings to come and impact people living in a family because they love this person, they care about this person, and they have maybe some anticipation about what's to come based on
Right.
what they've seen or heard from other people. But what we know is that every person's experience is very unique. And so we
Yes.
cannot presume to know, how their course is going to go. And so that's another thing with families that we try to explain, that it's important to take this one step at a time and to just follow the disease process along and keep meeting people where they are. And life will sort of guide you into the kinds of interventions you need to do at any given time.
Right.
Um,
Oh,
oh,
sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
The one thing though I also love for families, and especially adult children and families that have dementia in there somewhere, some sort of dementia, is that it's important to recognize that everyone in the family is dealing with this differently. And so, what we can see is some added stressors in the family dynamics. And so, we want to, by calling out the fact that this is actually impacting everyone in different generations, hopefully, families will be more understanding and open up more communication opportunities to try to help one another and recognize what each other needs, because people see it all differently, especially if some are not living in the area. And so if families know that, they can
Yeah.
hopefully be more understanding of each other.
Well, and hopefully we all have a little more grace with each other for sure. So I've actually had several friends who have dealt with this, and one of them said, I snapped at my dad and I feel awful about it. And they just couldn't seem to let it go. That guilt spiral started really quickly. What would be your immediate advice, Les?
That's a great term for it, because that's what happens, right? We
Yeah.
Our automatic thoughts take over. We have an experience, and there can be 50 good things that we've done, but it's the one negative thing that we've said or done that we sort of hold on to. And so again, the practice of positive self-talk is something I spend a lot of times trying to work with people about, is catching themselves with the self-criticism and trying to really work on self compassion and trying to understand that we're human, that we have emotions, that we will sometimes have days that we're a little less patient, that we are a little bit more critical of ourself. So some of the self-talk things that I try to work people through is telling yourself that I'm doing the best that I can. And I think that's really a true, honest statement that most people feel, they can use without being and disgenuine. Um, One moment of frustration doesn't erase all the great care that I normally do. And so I put that in people's toolbox to be able to use, that we do a lot of things well, and we will
Mhm.
make mistakes, but that doesn't define sort of who we are. And it's normal to feel overwhelmed, and we can forgive ourselves for those moments where it just feels like too much, or we're maybe we wish we would have answered something a different way.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing though that's important is if people are noticing that is becoming common, that they're snapping a little bit too much, or they're noticing that when they respond, um, to the person they're helping to care for, that their reaction is causing a reaction in them, that's really a really big indicator that you might need a little bit more support.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jill, in thinking about my friend who has snapped at her dad, feels terrible about it, how can she and her family in that moment support dad, really to help him feel safe?
I think what caregivers need to remember is that people living with a dementia are doing the best they can with the parts of the brain that they can still access. So, those coping mechanisms for the person living with dementia, coping mechanisms that they used to tap into may no longer be available to them. So we may need to provide that for them. Maybe
Right.
it's a favorite snack. I know with my dad, it was always getting on his tractor, mowing his lawn, or doing gardening. So now we have to bring the gardening inside because of my dad's mobility issues. He's not able to get outside. It's not safe for him to be on a tractor. It's also important for caregivers to remember that we can't bring them, the person living with dementia, into our reality. It's not fair for that person because, again, they're living with a changing brain. So we need to validate where they are, what abilities and strengths still remain for them. And one of the best things we can do is for people living with a dementia, a lot of times they're not able to speak about, I feel scared or I feel anxious.
Right.
So, for example, not only are we celebrating Thanksgiving with my parents, but we are also moving them 4 hours into senior living.
Mm.
And so my mom is busy packing the house up, and my dad is not able to help. But now he's starting to get angry. He's showing signs of being anxious.
Right.
And this is because he wants to help. He feels scared. And so I've told my mom, talk to him about that. Give him the words. This must feel very scary for you. And then I had her get his coins out and have him help sort those coins. But giving the person the words, this
Right.
must feel very frustrating for you because suddenly they feel seen and they feel heard and validated.
Right. Let's talk about anticipatory grief. So let's say someone's spouse is forgetting their name. What is that person going through?
Yeah, that's a huge loss for people. It can be really devastating for family members when that happens, right? These are folks that have been together for decades often and feel like they have been through thick and thin. And it is really surprising to family members often when the person living with the dementia can't remember them or gets confused about who they are, right? It's not uncommon for a husband to think that his wife is his mother, for example, or for their daughter to be their wife. And so it's not only sad, but it's confusing. But I want to talk about in the context of that of anticipatory grief and what that means. It's really the process of mourning the loss of who the person was, but also what they had in mind for what the present should look like and also for the future. So there's a lot of different loss that's in that, a lot of sadness, and a lot of grief of what's ahead. We actually call this the slow goodbye. There's a lot of information out there about this feeling because as dementia will progress, often a person would get to the point where they may not be able to identify their family members in the same way. What we try to tell family members, especially in the dementia world, is that very often the person living with dementia does know something about them. They know they're comfortable. They know they're safe. And so that's one of the ways we try to help people get through that. And just again meeting their loved one where they are, even though they might not identify them the same way. Um, but it's really important to recognize the sadness and again help them see this as a normal part of the process for many.
Absolutely. And Jill, what about the grief that is experienced by the person living with dementia?
And I'm so grateful that you bring this up because I think a lot of times when we think about Alzheimer's and related dementias, we only think about the grief of the caregiver. And we're not thinking about all of the changes and the loss that somebody living with the diagnosis experiences. My friend Mike always talked about his changing brain as a fire in the library. So he'll talk about how there's books and sections that still remain,
Right.
but then there's fires in other ones that he can't access. Just like Les was saying, may not remembering who a child is or who a friend is. That was a fire in the library that he can't get back. But when you think about grief, I think about my dad, and I think about where he is in his journey with dementia. And he's a father, he's a husband, he's an educator, um, he's a craftsman, and he
Right.
was a provider. Well, he can no longer do his crafts anymore because of his changing brain, visual, dexterity. He doesn't always remember who I am. So waning on playing that role as a father, and he's not a provider anymore.
Right.
And so the story that I talked about my parents moving, my dad always made these big decisions. He was always a provider of the family. And I know that parts watching all of this packing going on, and he doesn't feel like he's a part of it. He's grieving the loss of being able to be the provider and feeling needed. And so that's something I've been talking to my mom about, as well as talking about to other caregivers about, is we need to make sure that the person living with the diagnosis still has an opportunity to give back to the community, to be a provider, and to feel needed.
Right.
We all have a need to feel needed. And that can be little things. Like I talked about the coins, my dad sorting the coins. That's his job. My mom needs him to do that.
Right. You have less in situations like what Jill is talking about. How do you help someone find themselves again?
It's a process, and I think part of what we do is, again, try to normalize that every day is going to look a little bit different, but to, understand that finding that balance is possible, and this is often where counseling can be useful to people if they're open to that idea, but simply just the support of family, friends, or even spiritual leaders, again, to help them feel like they can reach out and try to do different things. One of the examples that comes to mind is a gentleman who is taking care of his mom, but he starts to say, "Well, I used to be a golfer, right? I used to, be a husband and a friend, and now this caregiver, and that's all that I do, and that's all that I am." Well, first
Mhm.
off, it's a great job and role. It's important. We all need to take care of one another in our communities. But what he's saying is he doesn't feel that he's himself, that he's missing out on things. So one thing that I try to assess for folks is if they are feeling like the role is too much and if they might need a little respite care or more support in the daily caregiving role, so that there might be an opportunity to still go and play a game of golf if that's something that is important and can be valuable. Jill was talking about the fact that as individuals we see ourselves and define ourselves in different ways, so really figuring out what is it that people miss about what they're no longer able to do and to see if there's a way to include at least some bits of that back into their lives where they are now. Again, I can't say practice self-care enough, and people um, have a different definition for what that means. But really, truly, some of the stuff that Jill mentioned before as well is sleep and nutrition, exercise if possible, even if it's just a walk, but some sort of activity that helps the care partners feel like they are taking care of their basic needs. Um, I also, work with people to talk about it might be time to think of some new activities, perhaps with their family member who has a dementia. So it might be still golfing, but doing fewer um, golf holes or using the cart more.
Right.
So being creative with how to find parts of yourself that you miss, but that still find a way to balance that into the life that you have now. And expecting good days and bad days. This is true for all of us. But I think especially when folks are having a loved one with a dementia, and as that disease progresses more and more care is required, it's even that much more important to find the balance of what they miss about what they used to be like.
Absolutely. And you use the words care partner instead of caregiver. Why does that distinction matter so much?
I think that this is very, very true, and I'm sure Jill is going to say more about this because it's language matters, right? She said
Right.
that early on, and I totally agree with that. This is especially true in the early stages, but even as Jill mentioned, we want to make sure in the later stages that people are still included and that we recognize their personhood, and that we include the it's a shared journey, right? So that we are including all the persons involved in an appointment, for an example, or in a hospital room. And so I think that if we just use the term caregiver, it seems really, a one-way direction.
Right.
It doesn't really highlight the partnership that really is the true experience. And so I really try to use care partners as frequently as possible. And like Jill mentioned, making sure that all of the medical providers, for example, in my hospital work or my clinic work, that we are recognizing that we are sensitive to how caregiving can be perceived by the person actually living with a dementia.
Yes. And Jill, you insist that people living with dementia can still make decisions. We've talked a little bit about this. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure, choice can empower cognition.
Hmm.
And it's important that, we're talking about people living with a diagnosis are people first.
Right.
And so we want to preserve autonomy. And we certainly don't want to create learned helplessness because, especially as the disease progresses, or sometimes as care partners, we become impatient. It's quicker for us to just do the task for the person, when in reality, the person may be very capable of doing it. They're just slower to process the information
Right.
and then begin the task. And so it's really important for us to still allow for choice and decision making for people living with advanced dementia, or folks who maybe struggle more with the language and the processing. Again, they can still make choices with their nonverbals.
Right.
Language, spoken language, is just a small part of how we communicate with each other.
And again, is so powerful. So, so powerful. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries. Les, what's one boundary that every care partner can set in their first month? Because when we get into talking about self care, I feel like boundaries are so important.
So I'm gonna go big on this one, because I think it's a super sensitive subject, and it's about driving. This is an issue that is really big for both the person living with a diagnosis. It's one of the things we fear a lot because
Yeah.
driving is such an important part of independence and autonomy. I think that it is an opportunity, especially if a person has like a mild kind of impairment or they're just getting that diagnosis, which in that situation, it is very typical that a person would still have a lot of capability for safe driving. But sometimes when family members hear that diagnosis, they immediately want to intervene. And so I think this is an area where you can intervene in a way, but but setting a boundary about when is it that that should happen. And so I think that's a conversation I would be glad to talk more about.
Yeah, this is actually something we walked through as a family with one of my grandmothers, and it was a very challenging process for both of my parents. So, can you talk us through what is the script? How should someone approach this?
So it may look a lot different in the later stages. If safety is a concern and that person is really struggling, maybe they're denying that they are not able to drive. But I want to propose the idea that people start to talk about this much earlier in the disease process and right after the diagnosis. Once people sort of hear it and set with it a little bit. One family member I'm thinking of in particular is that to just say, Dad, look, I want you to keep driving for now, but the day may come where that may not be safe. And so I want your help now on how I should talk to you about that when that happens. What do you think we should do if you can't drive anymore? How would you like us to tell you that? How would you like us to proceed? Now, it could be that dad says, I don't think that will ever be a problem.
Right.
But I think part of having that conversation helps family members feel less guilty and a little bit more empowered to know when to do that. Instead, a lot of folks will avoid those difficult topics such as
Right.
driving or managing medications. And so if you have the opportunity in the early stages, I really do feel like people should take on some of those topics to try to include their family member, and maybe even have them write it down in their advanced directives or their power of attorney document, which I hope everyone has, by the way. um, but it just, I think, helps families be prepared and be able to know that they've tried to include them. Just as Jill is saying, it's really important to partner with people if you can, to try to plan ahead for things that might be difficult.
Well, and I love that you said having these conversations earlier, because to your point, and Jill's as well, I think so often families are like, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, like not wanting to have that conversation. But at the same time, if we are having that early, if we are involving the person living with dementia, our family member, the person we love in that conversation early on, getting their thoughts and feelings about what they want and how important that is. I mean, both of you have talked about that today.
It helps with the caregiver guilt as well, because
Yes.
you have written down exactly what your loved one wanted or
Yes.
didn't want, especially even if it comes to providing in-home care or moving into senior living. By having those conversations early, you can have that documented so that you know you're speaking truly on behalf of your loved one.
Yes. And Jill, we talked earlier about that holiday dinner scene. What are some practical changes that could transform that entire situation? Whether it's environmental, it's food, distractions, what could people do?
Well, we talked a lot about the holiday dinner. I think what might be a practical tool for our listeners is thinking about like a typical meal.
Hmm.
And maybe your loved one is getting stuck, maybe not eating, even though they say that they're hungry. So a
Right.
lot can go on at the dinner table. Think about what's going on distraction wise. I know earlier today we had a truck beeping. That may be distracting for somebody living with a dementia, but also some of the visual things that we can control. I always give the example of if you had a white tablecloth with a white plate, and then we served plain chicken, mashed potatoes, no gravy, just plain,
Hmm.
and macaroni and cheese. For one, it's not going to look very appetizing, but for the other, visually, they may not be able to see that there's even a plate on the table because it's all the same color.
Mm.
So, really making sure that food is identifiable for the person. The other is knowing where the person's deficits are.
Right.
So, for example, somebody may have executive functioning difficulties, which means their starter button is broken. So,
Right.
while they're telling you, yes, I'm hungry, and the food is in front of them, they're not eating. So,
Right.
it could just be prompting them, oh, your chicken smells so great. How does it taste? That may be enough to get them started, or they may need some help getting that muscle memory going. So, some hand under hand or hand over hand, whatever that prompting and cueing may be, or maybe finger foods is how that person is successful. But the key is we need to keep attentive and watching and listening, really being a detective on where is the person getting stuck and how can I better meet their needs? Because our goal for our loved one, but the goal for the person is to still remain independent, especially when it comes to meals,
Right.
because no one aspires to be fed a meal when we
Absolutely.
get older.
Well, and I never thought about the colors on the plate of the different, whether it's vegetables, chicken, mashed potatoes with no gravy, like that being an issue. I
Yes.
never thought about that.
Yeah, because if you think about the changing brain, not only maybe you already have some visual problems just due to normal aging, but then depending on the dementia and the part of the brain that is affected by dementia,
Hmm.
you can have even more visual deficits.
Right. Les, you've mentioned acceptance and commitment therapy. To some people, that may sound really intimidating. What is one technique that someone could try this week?
Yes, I think you're right. It does sound like a lot of words, and therapists use a lot of different approaches when they're working with folks. But I love acceptance and commitment therapy because it really just kind of meets people where they are, right? So, and when it comes to living with a person with a dementia, what we hope is we try to help reduce the guilt that people might feel and not judge themselves and just sort of accept the situation they're in, but try to problem solve how to manage it better. And so there's also something in this type of practice we call values grounding, which really allows for care partners to just think about their personal values, what's important to them. Like we always talk about with the person with the diagnosis, what matters to them and accommodating that. It's super important. But again, if we're talking about partnerships and trying to manage this as a family, we want to make sure that caregivers are also not neglecting their needs as well. So one really good routine I like to do first is super simple. Anybody can do this. So your viewers can do this right now. But you sit, in a way that's comfortable. And you just take a few really deep breaths in through your nose and exhale through your mouth. And you just do that about 10 to 15 times. And just being present with yourself for a minute. That's something we can do if we're at a light, in traffic. We can do while we're staying in line at the grocery store. And we certainly should do it if we notice we're starting to feel a little bit impatient with the person we're caring for, that we just take a few of those breaths. So that's number one. Step two of try to do this is tell yourself, what kind of care partner do I want to be today? What strategy do I want to use today to try to get through any difficult times that I have? Okay. And so do I want to be extra patient? Do I want to remind myself to be patient? Do I want to be kind? Do I want to try humor today? And so you just want to really try to think through the fact that there are likely going to be problems, but you're going to go in knowing that you have a strategy to manage it. And then the last step that I often encourage people to do is to give yourself a post it note. This works for people living with a diagnosis as well. But for the care partners, it's really important, especially if you know there's a high stress part of the day, right? Jill talked about knowing when the best part of the day is for a holiday dinner, for example. You want to schedule around that. But care partners should be thinking about what's the toughest time of day for us and what can I do to just sort of give myself that nudge on the side, like, hey, this might be a little tough at dinner time. What can I do to remind myself to take a few deep breaths and that we're going to get through this?
Absolutely. I love that you talked about just the taking deep breaths and grounding yourself. I mean, that's something, if I start to have anxiety, that is something I know to do just to get regrounded, recentered, and be able to keep going. So I love that you bring that up. I think that's great. Jill, you've been following the Pointer study. Can you talk about what are some everyday actions that can protect brain health?
Absolutely. The Pointer study is something I'm so excited about because, I've been doing this like less for 30 years. And when you received a diagnosis or your loved one received a diagnosis, it felt like the end. Where now I know it can be the beginning of a wonderful journey. But the Pointer study actually puts tools back into our toolkit that we can control
Right.
to increase our cognition. And so this was a 2-year study. It just was published in July of this year, put out through the Alzheimer's Association. And so what it talks about is, back in the day, we talked about the American Heart Association drilled in us what was great for our heart. The great thing is we don't have to relearn because everything that they taught us, which was good for our heart, is also good for our brain. So less talked about exercise, making sure we're getting a variety of exercise. Maybe that's walking, maybe it's yoga, hiking,
Right.
um, different exercise, uh, socializing. It's so important not only for our care partners, but also for the person living with a diagnosis to keep up with those connections,
Yes.
not saying, I can't do it today because I have too many caregiving responsibilities. It's so important. The other pieces are the mind diet or nutrition. I mean, think about when you're hungry or you feel dehydrated, you feel foggy.
Right.
So imagine somebody living with a dementia, and then on top of that, they're skipping a meal or they're not hydrated. So they're going to experience even more brain fog.
Right.
And then, of course, there's some wonderful uh, cognitive uh, games and programs that we can do online, or there's other places who are offering these. But what this study showed is that these lifestyle changes actually can protect our brain from cognitive decline for folks at risk of developing one of the dementias.
Yes.
But it also can help our folks who are already living with a diagnosis protect those parts of the brain that aren't affected. And I just love that there's a piece of control that comes back to us.
Yes.
And so we don't have to feel as helpless.
I love that. Les, when someone walks into your office drowning in care partner stress, what happens in that first session?
Yeah, that's a common thing, right? As people are trying to manage so much on their own, it is often a crisis that might even lead them to that. So it's pretty overwhelming by the time we see people often. So I really just let the caregiver sort of drive the session and listen to them and hear what it is they want to talk about. And I do that without judgment. I really just try to be a neutral place for them to share what's on their mind. One of the perks, I think, of professional um, counseling is that I don't know them. I'm just hearing their perspective. And so if you're talking to a family member, a neighbor, a spiritual leader, they also know the person that you're caring for or with. So it sometimes will really limit how honest you can be about what you're really feeling and what you're really going through. So I really mainly want to make sure that people know that it's safe, that it's confidential, provided they aren't, going to harm themselves or anyone else.
Right.
But I just really want to understand what's going on with them, and so that I give them that space. If they're open to it, we might do one of those relaxation exercises together for just a few minutes. And right away, I try to let people leave that first session with one tool at least. So maybe that's a prompt to write a particular journal article, or to go for a 5-minute walk, around the house. But just something that feels um, like they're doing something for themselves that ties back to the session. And then the subsequent sessions, we just sort of keep building off of that.
So let's talk about saying goodbye to who someone used to be while caring for who they are now. Les, how do you help families navigate that?
The first thing I try to help families understand is that their loved one, that's living with the dementia is still the same person. They're just a different version of themselves, and they still need all that love, support, and understanding that they've always needed. It just needs to be packaged a little bit different. And so I also try to help them reframe the situation and how what can feel burdensome sometimes, and is at times a challenge. It's still, there are some benefits, and there is even a gift in being able to be present and on that journey with people as you're trying to make, ensuring their comfort and that they're getting what they need through this process. I think that I try to help family members understand that communication um, even if it's challenging, that the behaviors, right? Like Jill talked about the various
Yes.
ways you can still communicate and understand, that the behaviors themselves can be a form of communication. And so, and if you have that history and you know this person, family members are really in a very good position to try to help give a person the best quality of life possible, despite some challenges that are happening with them. Um, I think to prepare, and trying to prepare for the slow goodbye that I mentioned,
Yeah.
is trying to engage, different family members in doing things like life review and having, discussions about past memories that people might be able to remember, bringing out things like pictures, and just talking about favorite memories in the story telling, and that can be really great for the intergenerational experience. I've had family make, people do quilts together, like just, whether that's cutting or sorting the fabric, depending on where that person is and their ability to help. Singing favorite songs together, hand mold. So, all kinds of things that people are able to do. And again, we want to make sure we're including that person with a diagnosis as long as possible up until the very end in whatever way that can be done. Um, so I think that those would be some strategies. But again, if people are finding difficulty coming up with ideas, this is where support groups and talking to other people who have lived through this, or if you're in a facility, to get the support of the staff to just try to keep finding ways to be engaged with them.
Yeah. One of the things that we did as a family, as both my grandfather and my grandmother started to show signs of dementia and Alzheimer's, was I would sit down and just have conversations and start recording, on a voice memo on my phone and start asking them questions about the past. One, to just get them thinking about it, but I really just for us wanted to know what they would say. And so it's really special memories for us to have now that they're both gone. And so, I love that you bring that up, Les. I think that's a great idea. Joe, we've talked a bit about how these conversations with a person living with dementia, especially those conversations about the future that can happen early on, what should families discuss while they can?
I love that Les said keeping the person involved all the way to the end because I think that's important. It goes back to they're a person
Right.
and they have a right to be a part of the conversation. But going back to Les's conversation about difficult conversations, as in with driving, I think it's so important that we talk about what are your no goes. For example, if you need a home care person to come in, what if I, as your care partner, am not able to bathe you and that is something that you need someone to assist you with?
Right.
Would you want a man or a woman? What is your preference? And and putting that down again, like we talked about, honoring their voice by asking them when they still can tell you
Right.
with words. Because even when someone is living with advanced dementia, they can still make choices. For example, would you like beef or chicken? And the person does not have to use words to indicate which they might prefer. They can point, you shot an eye over to the chicken, so I would serve you the chicken.
Right.
This can be with clothing. Do you want red socks or blue socks? And actually showing them because you're preserving autonomy, but it's also dignified and respectful.
Right.
And that really helps. Again, it goes back to that language in the perception that we have for ourselves. If we're still being included in the conversation, we still think highly of ourselves.
Right.
And that's important to preserve for people living with any stage of dementia.
When I can think too, or I would assume that just having those conversations early on, if there is someone that is writing down what the person living with dementia, their preferences are, that would probably lead to less family strife later as things progress. Because I think, as we all know, whether we have friends that have gone through this or we have ourselves, a lot of times when someone gets towards the end of their life and there's differences of opinions between family members of how things should be handled, having those things written down are really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Les, you started Maturity Matters Counseling because older adult therapy is really rare. What should families look for in professional support?
Yeah, it was really mind-boggling to me how difficult it was for our clients to get into a clinic. I mean, mental health care, especially after COVID and all the isolation and loneliness that people were feeling. Um, we had wait lists for every age group, that of folks who would be interested in professional counseling. But when I was putting together the clinic, and we only had a couple of clinicians at the time, I actually just tapped on the shoulders of my medical colleagues. So I was looking for people who would be able to understand what living with chronic health issues does to a person in their circle. I also wanted them to be able to have the ability to understand the emotional side, but also I thought it might be important to have somebody that could help problem solve and find resources, because often that is a huge part of being able to find the balance of life with a chronic health issue or a cognitive disorder. um and so I think that when family members are interested in counseling, the one thing they might think about is finding a clinic that takes Medicare insurance. Medicare is for older adults or people with disabilities, and so chances are, if you find a clinic that can accept that insurance, they will have some clinicians that are used to working with other clients that meet that category. Um, but what's interesting is that their Medicare pays a little bit less than some of the commercial insurances. So you need to call around. If you have an Advantage plan, you can call the number on the insurance card to find um, providers that maybe have experience in working with older adults or people with cognitive disorders. If you live closer to a city, medical centers might be a great place. Larger medical centers or hospital systems might be a good place to start. But the main thing is finding someone to talk to. And I feel that it's been it's not uncommon to have to wait for a few months to get an appointment even now. But if you ask very directly, do you work with older adults or people with chronic health issues? Chances are that person is going to have the skill set to help you through some cognitive challenges and what that means for your family.
Well, and navigating all of this can be so complicated. What are some tips that you can give people to be able to help them navigate the next thing? Or when is it time for people to stop going at it alone?
Yeah, well, I think it's always time for help, no matter what stage you are in the process, right? Like Jill said,
Right.
getting a diagnosis is just devastating to many people. And so finding someone that can help reframe that, hey, there's still a lot of life left. So how do we want to live that, and how do we want to navigate? But I think it's especially important to get help, whether that's a support group or a counselor, or again, just somebody that's been through this. As the process goes along, the caregivers are going to feel more exhaustion, they're going to have more sadness. And that especially is true as the personal care needs start to increase. All right, so maybe people are starting to need to manage incontinence issues, or some sundowning kind of behaviors, or nighttime waking. um, the other thing I try to educate care partners before it happens is that it's important to take care of yourself and your own health needs. In my hospital work, I can't tell you how many referrals I get of caregivers who are in a hospital bed in the emergency room, and they're so stressed about what they're going to do with, their loved one that's home with a dementia. And so these are the kinds of things where I try to really educate people about the value of planning ahead and to know where to find resources, whether that's through some of the national websites, or a local clinic, or a local support group, but getting help somewhere before the crisis happens. That's really, really important.
Yes. Jill, what are some resources that caregivers consistently miss?
I think the first one that comes to mind, because I'm such an advocate for people living with the diagnosis, is while you're getting yourself support through support groups, look for one for your loved one as well, especially if they're navigating this in the earlier stages.
Right.
It's so important. You know, we can talk about, Les and I can talk about all day long supporting people living with a diagnosis and caregivers, but until you're walking in those shoes yourself, you can't 100% know. But there's something about support groups where you don't feel alone. I'll also say a lot of caregivers I find forget about the area agency on aging and disability, and they're going to provide different support depending on where you are.
Right.
They can help you do a safety evaluation on your house to see what kind of safety measures that you can change or put into place so that you can live there longer. I will also say there's, depending on where you are, but also Medicare has a new program called the Guide Program. Now, there's parameters around it. It has to be straight Medicare, but it's to keep people living with a diagnosis supported. And so I think as we as a society support caregivers and people living with a diagnosis, we need to continue to ask questions. What am I missing to your doctor? What other resources do you have? I know one of the areas of concern is depending on where you live, especially if you live rurally, receiving a diagnosis can be hard because it can take 2 to 3 years just to see a neurologist.
Right.
And so it's exciting for me to see some of these virtual practices come up. So, virtual neurologists that can work with your primary doctor for you
Right.
to get a diagnosis so much sooner and then connect you with the additional resources that you and your care partner need in order to continue to live well. So I want caregivers to know, ask the questions, do your research, educate yourself, be curious.
Yes. So, for both of you, as a caregiver, how do I know if I'm doing enough? Les, do you want to take this one? You want to start?
Sure, absolutely. I think that if you remember some of like the acceptance and commitment therapy example I used, right? What you're really trying to do is accept these sort of uneasy feelings as a normal part of the process. You're going to have moments where you're not sure what you're doing, you're not sure you're up for this, that you know that you need some more help, and so knowing that you might be uncomfortable sometimes, but this isn't going to define you, and there are resources out there to get through it. So using that positive self-talk that we talked about, right? So putting up those post-it notes, and living in the moment. Anxiety is really pretty invasive when we are dealing with chronic health issues, especially if you're a care partner to somebody that's living with a disease that can be pretty unpredictable over time. So trying to live in the moment and not getting too far ahead of ourselves of what's ahead. I mean, it makes sense to do some planning, but you want to do that when you're calm and you can be thoughtful about, is it time to move, or do I need to hire some help in, or do I need to let my daughter come and stay the night once in a while? So there's those kinds of things. But if you let your anxiety take you too far forward, it's really hard then to be present and do all the caregiving stuff that you need to do.
Well, Jill, what about you? How do I know if I'm doing enough?
I always like to tell families if you're asking that question, it's time to assess what kind of other resources and help do you need? Because by a care partner or a caregiver asking me that question, that tells me that they're feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed. And so, really taking the time to look at what's going on with that care partner. How is their health? How is their stress? Are they eating regular meals? Are they taking care of their own health?
Okay, there has been a lot that we have shared and covered today. Les, what is one thing you want people to take away?
I think the main thing is that there's no right way to do this journey. Depending on the type of dementia a person has, the type of resources you have, where you live, it's just so unique. And so I just really hope that people will be kind to themselves, know that it's a long journey, but there are resources there to help so you don't have to do it alone.
Jill, what is one thing you want people to remember from today?
I want people to remember the analogy when you're on the airplane and you have to put on your own mask before
Mm,
you help somebody with their mask. It's
yes.
so important for caregivers and care partners to take care of themselves so that they can show up and be the best care partner or caregiver to their loved one.
Yes, absolutely. And before we close, I want to thank both of you for the incredible work that you do every day. Les, you've been in the trenches with families for over 25 years. How does it feel to share this knowledge with our viewers today?
Well, I feel really grateful, honestly, to have been asked to be here to share some of what I've learned. Really, I've worked with thousands of people through the years. And so, thank you for having me. I hope I've been able to share some of what their experience has been to help people know that they're not alone.
And Jill, your advocacy for people living with dementia really comes through. What is it like for you to have a platform like this to talk about dignity and respect?
I think platforms like this one are so important because it reminds us that a person isn't defined by their disease. It also spreads awareness
Yes,
and it normalizes asking for help.
yes, which I think often we all need to do a little bit more of.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both again for being here today. And as always, you can find this episode and more at brookdale.com/webcast or on our YouTube channel. We hope that you'll share it with anyone who might benefit. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.